Hi, welcome back. Here we are at week 7. The purpose of this lecture this week is to address the ethics of college sport and supporting athletes. This week's lecture is going to begin with our Dixon article, and that comes out of Morgan's text. And this article is the ethics of supporting sports teams. We'll be looking at your role as a fan and discussing how that is moral and or ethical when we support our sports teams. What teams and athletes are you a fan of? Are you a fan of a university team? Are you a fan of a professional team? Is there a certain athlete that you like to follow? These are all things that Dixon discusses or thinks through when he begins to address the partisan fan versus the purist fan. The partisan fan is the fan that's a loyal supporter of the team because the fan has become or has some sort of personal connection or familiarity. So think about it this way. Do you support a team because you have some type of relationship with the athletes? Do you know someone on the team? Do you have a connection? This happens oftentimes in university sports. We may know someone who plays, or even high school sports. We see this when we have the well-being of the player or athlete in mind. So for example, maybe you know someone who is a coach of a team, and therefore you want that team to do well because you have the best well-being of that coach or team in mind. This also derives out of things like geography and proximity. Are you a fan of the local team? That is, living in Houston, all things are Houston Astros, Houston Texans, and Houston Rockets. The local news, the billboards, and the like. And then sometimes you may even become a fan of those teams because friends ask you to attend games and you get to be a part of the local geography surrounding a certain team. So this is where we are exposed to those local teams and we become fans because we attend those local games or we have friends that are a part of it and the like. That's our partisan fan. And we would, again, use the word loyal supporter of a team. And for some of you, this may have been passed down from your family. So what's the purist fan? This type of fan is a loyal supporter of the nature of the sport or competition. This fan wants to see a well-played game. This fan is concerned then with games that are well played and skillful. So this fan may be a fan right now of what we would say the Golden State Warriors. Why? Because the Golden State Warriors have exuded over the last several years excellent play in the game of basketball. Or maybe this fan is someone who wants to turn on and cheer for a said team during a championship run, merely for the sake of watching the team play well. And some of you indeed might be a purist fan for some sports. Let's think about this. Maybe you're a very loyal fan, say, for the Houston Texans, and you have a personal connection and you cheer for them ardently. But maybe you're a purist fan of the game of volleyball, and you'll follow the game of volleyball just because you want to see a game well played. And so whatever team is doing well at that time, you'll follow. Okay, we're going to move on in the next several slides to continue to talk about our partisan fan and purist fan, and we'll be addressing some examples and evaluating the good and bad of these fans. Let's talk our way through some examples of what this difference between a partisan fan and a purist fan looks like. Obviously, most of you know I'm from the state of Ohio, and so we have avid sports fans in the state of Ohio. Some of us, you could argue, are so smart, and some maybe not so smart. For example, I have several friends who are avid and loyal supporters of the Cleveland Cavaliers because they are a fan, or maybe particularly because they're from that city. Or maybe, like myself, having attended the Ohio State University, I am now a loyal Buckeye, and so I follow and am a loyal fan of. It's interesting then, as we talk about this partisan fan, the nature of a partisan fan is to offer the allegiance to one team so much so that we may possibly have a hatred towards a rival team. And as many of you know, the Ohio State University has a staunch rival. It's that team up north. See, I don't even say the name. I don't like anything about them. And I love it when that team up north gets beat. Why? Because I'm a partisan fan of the Ohio State University, and therefore my loyalty to them lies in ensuring that my rival also is defeated. So who's the Purist fan? And being in the city of Houston, or as a university in the city of Houston, we've seen this specifically surrounding a very popular athlete, J.J. Watt. Many individuals find him to be a likable character who gives back to the community and therefore want to see him potentially do well. And so they will appreciate him as a player and as an athlete and will be a Purist fan of just say JJ and maybe the Texans. We also may see this in the example of Drew Brees. Some argue he exemplifies what is right about the game, and therefore they simply will just be a supporter of that athlete. The purist in this sense would find it completely acceptable to cheer both for J.J. Watt and for Drew Brees. And notice the distinction though on the other side. The partisan fan really would not find this acceptable, because that partisan fan is loyal supporter of an individual team and or athlete typically, and they want that athlete or team to do well above all else. So in this instance, if we had our J.J. Watt and Drew Brees example, a partisan fan couldn't indeed really be fans of both. But a purist fan is the one that looks at this and determines that they can be a fan of those individuals in our games. And arguably in 3 years, that may change and they may become a purist fan of some other athlete that exemplifies some of the beauty of the game. So let's assess the morals of these two differing fans. Our partisan fan, and I maybe have used this word before, is what we would consider a diehard fan. We think about my allegiance to The Ohio State University, and that fan is often willing to stick by players and personnel and any other changes. So for example, regardless of the new coaching regime at The Ohio State University for their football program, I am indeed still going to be a fan of their team. And this diehardness or this blind fandom, some might even call this admirable as a willingness to support and accept a team. We'll talk about the ethics of that in just a minute. Some argue on the other side for our purist fan that this person may really not be a fan at all. And arguably our diehard fans might call this purist fan a fair weather fan. So let's go back to our example of a purist following or supporting the Golden State Warriors right now because they're exuding exemplary play. So then you could see where the purist in the next coming years may then become a fan of the Toronto Raptors because they now are the team that is exuding and exemplifying exemplary play. So that fan we could see has this fair weather mentality according to what our diehard fans would say. It's also important to note, though, that when we assess the morals of that purist fan, some may even approach these games neutrally in hope of seeing a well-played game. You can think about this. Purists might be fans of the games themselves, rather than fans of a team or athlete. Purist fans are fans of the games or maybe even the sport. They want to see a well-played basketball game, more so than a partisan fan would want to see their Houston Rockets win a championship. And many would argue, though, that does that qualify as a fan because of this condition on it? We'll talk a little more in just a sec. Let's address the moral behavior of partisan versus purist fans a little more in detail here. As we've already talked about, that partisan fan may be deemed admirably because of their loyalty to a team. They may even be praised for their willingness to stick by a team. However, I hope you're starting to see that there's also some concern with this blind support. Let's go back to my example of The Ohio State University. As a fan of that team and university, clearly it's been interesting because that university's football program has been embroiled in a number of scandals lately. A partisan fan, because of their blind loyalty, would arguably continue to support that team even when behaving unethically. And a partisan fan often, sadly, overlooks these behaviors. I also want us to think about the example of, say, the Cleveland Browns. Many of you know the Cleveland Browns have not had a history of being a good team or a good franchise. They've arguably been the laughingstock of the NFL. And the partisan fan, though, is continually loyal to that team. And as you may already know, some of those Cleveland Brown fans in the dog pound have worn it as a badge of honor to be a fan of that terrible team. But is that ethical? When a team behaves so poorly and a front office behaves and or operates so poorly, is there any ethics or morals in supporting that team? So it can be argued as we begin to think about these concerns of this blind loyalty or support, especially of teams that may not deserve that blind loyalty or support, that maybe a partisan fan should consider being a fan of another. Okay, so what about the morals and or ethics of that purist? We could say that the purists can be praised for their concern for the well-being of the sporting contest. But because of the fact that they just want a well-played game, are they really a fan at all? So for example, we all know that there will be times that teams don't play well, that games don't go well. They may even be ugly and not well played. And does the purist fan then therefore chalk that up as a loss and no longer become a fan of that or want to watch that? So that's an area to think about. Ultimately, I want us to get us to a point, though, where we consider what's the most ethical way a fan can behave. We're getting there. Dixon finally gets us to the point of what he believes a fan should be. And in this instance, he gets us to what he calls a moderate partisan. And it's this twofold. It's the loyalty of a partisan fan. It's that individual who is indeed loyal and supportive of their team, but they have the reality of the purist. This fan then, although they are loyal to the team, can take a step back and be subjective and recognize that maybe, yes, indeed, I am a fan of The Ohio State University, and I will support their athletics. However, the reality of the purist in me says I find it very difficult to support the football program at times when they behave in such manners. Maybe even the recent coaching staff and the behaviors that they exuded. So this moderate partisan then, keeping with our example of The Ohio State University, would be able to then think subjectively, or you could argue objectively about the situation and say, I'm a fan of this team and I'm going to be loyal. However, I realize and have a reality that there are times that we don't need to be fans of a particular team and or athlete. And we have to take a step back and think about being subjective and or you could argue objective in our decision to continue to support. And maybe that means for a while, I won't support the Ohio State football program. I won't turn on their games. And then at some point, as the ethics may continue or grow, we'll turn it back on and I'll continue my loyalty to them. Dixon sums up this notion of a moderate partisan really well. It's that part purist and part partisan. And I want to read this statement because I think it helps us conceptualize this concept. The moderate partisan is what Dixon believes to be the ideal fan. This fan is indeed fiercely loyal, yet is able to recognize that those teams that don't play within the spirit of the game, follow the rules, that they aren't worthy of that admiration. And they can think through and process that. And we can say this with the example of the Ohio State University and or maybe the Cleveland Browns. So a team that behaves unethically or a team that doesn't perform well at all, that they indeed may not be worthy of fans' admiration. And with that, maybe we should consider pulling our fandom back. Or maybe we should consider being a fan of another organization. That, for Dixon, is what encapsulates a moderate partisan. Finally, after we've determined this notion of what it is potentially to be a good or right fan, Dixon poses this question. Should we be fans of particular teams at all? Is it moral to be fans of today's modern sport? There are several arguments against reasons why we shouldn't be fans of sport. And I've addressed some of those as we may have talked about, for example, the Cleveland Browns and the Ohio State University. Dixon, however, wants to give us some counter arguments to say that maybe indeed it is moral and okay in our society to be fans of sport. One of the first things that Dixon makes a point to recognize is that we find it quite appropriate and maybe even admirable to admire artists, musicians, actresses, and actors because of their sheer ability to perform, the use of their skills, and at times the beauty that comes out of their production. So, for example, in our society, it's completely acceptable and admirable to admire the skills of a beautiful artist who can paint, create, think through an image, an art piece of artwork, and we have no qualms about admiring that artist. And we do the same with musicians, people that create beautiful music. We admire them for their skill and for the talents they display. Dixon wants us to make this connection that in the same way athletes do this with physical excellence. And therefore, it is indeed acceptable to be a fan of today's modern sport. And Dixon would even find it moral. Maybe you consider, for example, a perfectly executed double play. And in that double play, you can admire the athletes for the skills necessary to execute that play. Maybe it's a perfectly executed floor routine in gymnastics. And we say, like we say when we admire artists and or even musicians, what a beautiful performance. And for Dixon, that's what it means to be arguably a moral fan of modern sport. Okay, second argument he wants to discuss. There are definitely teams that engage in unethical behavior. That is well known in today's popular media. We turn on the news every day and there's something unethical about the world of sport. But for Dixon, if we are moderate partisans, we will be able to take a step back, look at the situation, and determine whether that team is indeed worthy of our admiration. And so in that essence, or in that moment, that's what we do every day in our moral or ethical reasoning in life. And so he believes that in doing this with sport, we practice those moral and or ethical behaviors. And for Dixon, that helps us give meaning to why it's okay to be fans of sport. I have one more reason. The third area to consider as we address the question of should we be fans of particular teams or at all, and is it moral to be fan of today's modern sport? Dixon brings out our third point, that there are many teams and many athletes across the world of sport that not only strive for excellence in play, but also exude ethical behavior. And because of this, these teams and athletes are worthy of admiration. Previously, we gave the example of potentially J.J. Watt, maybe Drew Brees. Some would argue Tim Tebow and Dabo Swinney. And there are many that would fall under this of individuals and or teams that strive for excellence not only in their play, but in their behavior on and off the field of play. And because of this, Dixon wants us to recognize that those teams and those individuals are worthy of our fan admiration. And we should give them our admiration and be fans of them. The remaining portion of our lecture for week 7 is going to surround Simon Torres and Hager's chapter 6. And this is a discussion of sports on campus, intercollegiate sports and their critics. I think this actually falls and ties in nicely with our notion of fandom and fan behavior, because currently in our modern society, we have found ourselves to be staunch fans of intercollegiate athletics. And as you know, I went to that institution called The Ohio State University, and what is fascinated me about intercollegiate sports is how individuals are indeed staunch fans, partisan fans. Maybe not too many purists and maybe not too many moderate partisans. But growing up in the state of Ohio, we had staunch fans of intercollegiate athletics. So let's address then sports on campus. And we will be thinking about, over the next several slides, Simon, Torres, and Hager do this kind of goods and bads of college sport. So we're going to talk about first some of the ways that college sport, I'm going to call it the bads, those that give criticism and critiques. But hold on then, we're going to get us eventually to the areas of the defenses of college athletics. So think about the next several slides in twofold. The goods, and then we'll talk about, actually we're going to start about with the bads, and then we're going to talk about the goods. Simon, Torres, and Hager start us off by making sure we get through the framework of what is the purpose and value of higher education. Why are they doing this? They want us to make the connection that because of the nature or where college sports is housed, it's housed under an educational model and or higher education, they want us to try to think through and determine how intercollegiate athletics fit under this. So let's first go through the purpose and value of higher education. So if I said to you, what is the purpose and value of you getting a degree in higher education? And at this point in your career, you are getting a graduate degree in higher education. So what's the purpose in doing that? I hope you have a purpose. There is a purpose. So thinking through this, there's a number of ways that we view and value the purpose of higher education. For many institutions, they display this in the mission of the university. So for example, if we went through right now and looked up Houston Baptist University's mission of the university, we would find a number of principles. And I've listed some of these concepts here that are general concepts that usually encompass most universities' purpose and mission of higher education. One is that universities expose students to the best and brightest. It offers students an opportunity to work with some of the best faculty, some of the brightest colleagues, some of the brightest fellow students. And in doing that, it exposes us, students and faculty, on ways to critically think and analyze. And ultimately, that is one of the goals of that. You could argue, and I'm sure many of you might even say this with a graduate degree in a specific field, it's job training. And the purpose and value then of this higher education is we've been exposed to the brightest and the best. We've been given the opportunity to think critically and analyze, and we've been prepared for our job training. Another thought about the purpose and value of higher education from a societal standpoint is that higher education has served, or has come to serve rather, this gap between high school and the professional field. We know in our modern society, a high school diploma does not offer a ton of job opportunities. And so higher education or university education helps bridge that gap between high school and the professional fields. Okay, so now that we have some framework of what we would consider the purpose of higher education, then where do college athletics fit in all of this? So this is where Simon, Torres, and Hager come with this notion of the incompatibility thesis. Please, please, please pay attention to this detail. I recognize that earlier in the term, we talked about the incompatibility thesis in relationship to cheating. For this, and I will try to always preface it in your quizzes and or other material, this is the incompatibility thesis related to university and college athletics. So the question is that Simon, Torres, and Hager pose, are intercollegiate athletics compatible with the mission of a higher education? The incompatibility thesis goes on to address this by suggesting that the current state of any form of serious intercollegiate athletics, and I think we could argue for the most part, absolutely Division I athletics falls under this, and arguably some Division II will as well. Simon, Torres, and Hager go on to say that this form of serious intercollegiate athletics is incompatible, does not fit with, maybe even goes against the academic values and the mission of the university. We're going to go on and talk about a number of reasons why this is so. Simon, Torres, and Hager go on to provide 5 ways for they want to defend this incompatibility thesis. Recall what this means. They're providing 5 ways to help us talk through and determine that intercollegiate athletics is indeed not compatible with university mission. I would call this what we would consider the bad of college athletics. Simon, Torres, and Hager give us 5 reasons. They start off with corruption. Daily, we can turn on the news and find instances of concerns with corrupt behaviors in intercollegiate athletics. Fake classes, paying athletes, coaches doing illegal behaviors. The list goes on and on. Because of the nature of where we've gone with intercollegiate athletics, and we talked about previously with that incompatibility thesis, the high performance of intercollegiate athletics, corruption has resulted. The next area to defend this incompatibility thesis is graduation rates. Low graduation rates are common among high visibility men's programs, particularly in the name of football and basketball. In addition, Simon, Torres, and Hager talk about this notion of exploitation. And let me read a quote from them. They go on to state things like, if the purpose of participation becomes winning for the sake of external goals, such as visibility in financial sport, won't players come to be viewed as mere means to that end, rather than students to be educated? And so in this notion of exploitation for Simon, Torres, and Hager, their concern is that college athletics has become such a money-making machine that we are doing this at the cost of treating student athletes as cogs in this system rather than as students to potentially be educated. And so that's one of the ways. We also have to recognize that student athletes might be exploited in a number of other ways. We give student athletes scholarships, obviously for an education, and it can be argued many aren't getting an education. The demands placed upon these student athletes are so great that they can't prepare for anything outside the life of intercollegiate athletics. The next area for defending the incompatibility thesis is spending, and I find this one maybe the most startling and most troubling. Spending on student athletes is significantly higher than spending on the general student. So this is a very key point in articulating the defense of incompatibility thesis, where intercollegiate athletics may not fall in line with the mission of the university. So for example, Simon, Torres, and Hager's give the number that approximately $103,000 is spent on per student athlete, and universities roughly spend only $15,000 per student. We're talking roughly 7 times the amount we spend on a student, we spend on student athletes. And so what does that tell us? That maybe college athletics aren't compatible with universities. Finally, there are some problems with the black male athlete. And this comes in our notion, hopefully we could make this connection, as I talked about graduation rates just a second ago. The graduation rates of our high-profile men's sports, particularly college basketball and football, are low. And this begins the plight of the black male athlete. We have a disproportionate number of black male student athletes in our football and basketball rosters. And then we could see where this results in lack of graduation rates and maybe even additional exploitation for these athletes. Okay, this gets us through what I'm going to call the bad of college athletics. This is where we've defended this incompatibility thesis, that we've given these 5 reasons of why college athletics may not align with the mission of the university. We're going to go on now and talk about some ways that we can defend college athletics. Let's move on now to talk about the defenses of college athletics. Some of us may consider this what is the good of college athletics. Simon, Torres, and Hager provide us 6 total reasonings, 3 here and 3 on the next slide. First is this concept of social utility. Proponents of college athletics argue that the universities provide entertainment to the community, which is ultimately a service provided by the universities to society. This is this notion of social utility. What does this mean? Think about a small community that houses a major intercollegiate athletic program. Let's say, for example, Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Because of the entertainment value of, we'll say, Alabama football, and fans flocking to Tuscaloosa, Alabama on a weekly basis for those football games, people provide social utility, or these fans rather provide social utility by contributing to the local economy. This is not something we typically think about. That this provides ultimately a service to society, mainly, in this example, the local community of Tuscaloosa. Okay, next concept, enhancing academics. Well, we talked previously about when we were defending the incompatibility thesis that graduation rates are low for our high-profile men's sports, mainly football and basketball. This is the opposite of what we see for our other sports. So, for example, Simon, Torres, and Hager point out that athletics, particularly at Division I programs, graduate at higher rates than the general student body. And this is especially noted in women's intercollegiate athletics. So they want to point out that in the right circumstances, athletics can contribute and enhance academics and ultimately the mission of the university. So the next defense is an interesting one. It's this argument regarding performing arts. And former NCAA President Miles Brand says that it's difficult to find these substantive differences between student athletes and those studying performance arts. Think about our musicians, our artists, maybe our actors and actresses. In the same way that these people in performing arts train for their discipline, and they go to universities that have the reputation of that discipline, and arguably performing arts students also get some type of preferential admissions to the universities. This former university president, Miles Brand, wants to argue that while performing arts is viewed as participating in academics, then why is the student athlete not? Why is one credit, i.e. performing arts, more worthy than the other? And so this wants to point out that we indeed find performing arts as a critical part of universities, and we probably should view intercollegiate athletics similarly. The remaining three defenses of intercollegiate athletics surrounds these last three notions. The first one in this slide indicates this concept of cognitive skills. Simon, Torres, and Hager want to point out that athletes learn to analyze. They overcome weakness and they work hard to improve, and they are required to react intelligently and skillfully to situations that arise in performances and/or games. And this notion they want us to recognize is not that different, or may not be that different, from some of the cognitive skills that are taught in a classroom. And many of these same traits that are required to think through processes in performance are the same things that are required to think through processes in humanities and sciences. And so if done correctly, cognitive skills might be enhanced or practiced on the playing field. Diversity. The culture of athletics contributes to socioeconomic diversity on college campuses. And what does this mean? This often means then that campuses can potentially produce this mix of values, this mix of components, this mix of backgrounds. And the argument that Simon, Torres, and Hager want to make is that intercollegiate athletics is one of the ways that drives and contributes to this socioeconomic diversity on campus, as well as this surface level diversity on campus. The third and final on this slide, and our sixth total defense of intercollegiate athletics, is that intercollegiate athletics provides a way to practice and play out ethical values. Obviously, in the defense of the incompatibility thesis, we found some of those pretty negative ethical values. But Simon, Torres, and Hager want to point out that ethical values can be learned within the context of sport, and competitive sport by nature is value laden. And therefore, ethical values, if done correctly, can be taught, can be practiced, and can be encouraged in college athletics. This brings us to the end of week 7. We've gone through a number of key components in this lecture. We've addressed Dixon's components on our differing fans, the Purist and the Partisan, and we've determined that the perfect fan, if we could call it that, or the ideal fan rather, is a moderate partisan. The one who is loyal like a partisan, but tempered with the realization of a purist. And then we went on to talk about reasons why, under Dixon's argument, we can be fans of particular teams at all, and or why it is indeed moral to be fans of sport. We moved on then to address sports on campus with Simon Torres and Hager's article, and we differed it by looking at the good and the bad. And we determined the bad by those things which are incompatible to the university mission, and the opposite of that would have been those defenses of intercollegiate athletics. Okay, that does it for week 7. I'll see you back next week for our final week of this course.